So the panel is a result of, but also an extension of insightful discussions. I will let people who wish to leave for a short break do so, so that we don't. Bye, Fumi. So the good news is this is going to be sweet and short and sweet. So hopefully we'll have a dynamic discussion, but you know we won't keep you very long. So I was saying that this particular panel is a result of, but also an extension of discussions that have started in a special issue of the CODESRIA Bulletin, which I've had the privilege of coordinating. It's on Niger and the Sahel. And it is a discussion that was sparked by contentious debates surrounding a series of coups that have taken place in the region, particularly on the most recent one in Niger, which took place in July 2023. Between 2020 and 2023, there have been about half a dozen coups that have taken place in the region. So, people are, there's noise at the back. People are beginning to wonder if we are back to a season of coups in West Africa, as it is something that we've witnessed in the past, particularly in the 1990s. So is it a return of coups, or is it something else that we're witnessing? So since 2020, a lot has happened in the region. So the most recent conflict was sparked by a conflict, a rebellion against the state of Mali that started in the north of Mali in 2012. Since then, a lot of things have happened. There was subsequently, so that conflict transformed into, if you want to take a shortcut, a jihadist type of, a fight between states and non-state actors, so-called jihadists. And there have been international forces in place that have cooperated with Sahelian states to help them in the fight against terrorism. That cooperation has collapsed, and this is one major event that's taken place over the past couple of years, starting with Mali, then Burkina Faso, then Niger. Each one of these three Sahelian states, members of the G5 Sahel, which is an alliance of states piloted by France, and which is meant to mutualize resources among these five states: Somali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and Mauritania. So to mutualize resources in the fight against terrorism. Because of a lot of misunderstandings have taken place between, and I will try to make it quick, between Mali and France in particular, that relationship has collapsed. And the alliance itself is collapsing, because at the moment, as the three states have withdrawn, there are only Mauritania, Chad, and France left in that relationship. Then Mali is also asked the international humanitarian intervention coordinated by the UN, it's called the MINUSMA, to also leave. So the relationship with international partners has collapsed, and it has with tremendous consequences for the region, in the sense that these three states have become ostracized, not just by international partners, but also ECOWAS, to which they are a member. But so this is not my talk, so I should just introduce the panelists. So the people who've contributed in the special issue are Professor Hamidou Magassa, who is here with us today, Siba Grovogi, Folashade Soule, who's in Accra, Lionel Zevunu, who is in a flight as we're speaking, so he can't make it today, Moses Khisa, and Sebastiano Ruengabo. Moses is here with us, Umaru Abdulaziz from Niger, and myself. Shadrack Nasong'o's kindly accepted to discuss the two papers in the bulletin and the discussion here today. So Professor Magassa is from the Center for Research on Natural Resources based in Bamako. Shadrack Nasong'o is from Rhodes College in the US. Moses Khisa is from North Carolina State University. So without further ado, Professeur, vous avez la parole.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Je commencerai par rendre gloire au Seigneur de nous donner la paix de ce cinquantenaire du CODESRIA et en souhaitant à ceux qui pourraient être là pour le centenaire. Je ne serai pas peut-être là, mais je pense que le CODESRIA est dans cette voie. J'ai une pensée pieuse pour Samir Amin et le doyen Amadi Niang, avec qui j'ai eu l'avantage de participer au 23e anniversaire du CODESRIA au Caire, il y a quelques années de cela. Donc je vous remercie encore de solliciter ma contribution, en tout cas à la longue vie que le CODESRIA gagne. Parce qu'une des grandes qualités de l'Afrique, c'est la capacité de créer des liens sociaux, à la fois un avantage et un inconvénient. Et ce n'est pas un hasard si c'est le CODESRIA qui, à ce niveau, tient le lead, parce que c'est quand même une qualité africaine. Ça tombe également sur le cinquantenaire du décès d'un très très grand intellectuel sénégalo-malien, Omar Blondin Diop, qui est décédé à Gorée et à 26 ans. Et donc vraiment, ce sont ces mémoires qui me quittent aujourd'hui. Alors, pour aller juste sur le sujet par rapport au temps qui nous est accordé, je crois que le Mali est né en crise. Éclatement de la Fédération du Mali en août 60, création de la République du Mali en septembre. Donc crise de recherche d'une unité panafricaine. Et depuis, le Mali vit en tout cas en crise. Longue crise de société, crise de séparatisme, crise religieuse. Et peut-être le Mali va disparaître dans une crise très bientôt parce que il y a eu une recherche d'unité avec la Guinée. Ghana, Guinée, Mali, ça n'a pas été loin. Et maintenant, on est dans la recherche de l'alliance des États du Sahel entre le Mali, le Burkina et le Niger. Pourquoi ces pays continentaux qui n'ont pas connu la colonisation de la même manière que les pays côtiers comme le Sénégal ou la Côte d'Ivoire, parce que la colonisation est toujours venue par des voies maritimes et par le fleuve. Hein. Donc le Mali a connu peut-être 70 ans de colonisation, au Sénégal c'est peut-être 3 siècles. Donc il y a des réflexes de refus de l'État colonial qui ne passent pas. Donc dans tous ces 3 États, on est dans la recherche d'un État. On est dans la recherche d'un État parce que, qui a été accéléré avec l'intervention de l'OTAN et de la France en Libye. Parce que il y avait des liens très très forts entre le Mali et la Libye en construction, et notamment la partie Touareg du Mali, parce qu'il y a au moins 1% de Touareg au Mali. Ils étaient également libyens quelque part, parce que tous les Maliens ont une double nationalité, plusieurs nationalités. Donc l'intervention occidentale en Libye a complètement déstabilisé le Mali et créé cette crise dans laquelle nous nous situons depuis 2012. Et également avec la ville symbolique de Kidal, parce que les Français ont fait en sorte qu'ils étaient dans la logique d'un partage du Mali, comme ils ont fait avec le Soudan anglo-égyptien. Et ça n'a pas marché. Ça n'a pas marché parce que le Mali, quand même, c'est une construction d'empire et de royaume depuis 900 ans. Ce n'est pas un pays qui est créé comme ça. C'est un pays qui a eu une historicité extrêmement forte depuis l'Empire du Ghana, l'Empire du Mali, l'Empire Songhai. Sans discontinuité, les pouvoirs ont été là. Et je crois que c'est cet héritage qui fait que le projet de faire de la séparation du Mali n'a pas marché comme celui du Soudan anglo-égyptien, parce qu'il y avait deux Soudans. Le Mali s'appelait le Soudan français. C'était la compétition entre les Britanniques et les Français. Donc ce projet n'a pas marché et on se trouve aujourd'hui dans une situation en fait de démocratisation avec des élections, mais des élections contestées. Des élections contestées qui appellent des coups d'État répétitifs. En fait, de deux segments de la société, les intellectuels et les militaires, qui sont effectivement en confrontation pour pouvoir gérer l'État. Et cela montre quelque part que nos États ne sont pas le produit des dynamiques socio-culturelles. Nos États, c'est des États qui sont empruntés. Ce n'est pas nos États. C'est comme un objet qu'on vous donne, on vous dit de l'utiliser et vous n'avez pas du tout les ressources. Donc, de toute manière, on se trouve dans une situation extrêmement complexe. Et bon, les histoires de corruption, de tout ça, va venir parce qu'il y a une déficience dans la gouvernance de l'État. Parce que ce n'est pas un État qui est produit, ce ne sont pas des États produits par les sociétés. Les États qui peuvent avoir une stabilité, c'est les États qui sont produits par les sociétés. C'est comme une famille. Si vous vous rencontrez à deux, c'est que quelque part, vous pouvez faire un projet de famille. Mais si on vous impose des éléments extérieurs, ça devient extrêmement difficile. Donc, on se trouve dans une situation extrêmement complexe, mais très riche. Très riche parce que les segments séparatistes, je veux dire, de Touareg, au niveau de Kidal. Kidal, c'est le nord du Mali, c'est le sud de l'Algérie. C'est vraiment une passerelle. C'est comme des Twin Cities. Entre Kidal et Tamanrasset, et également ça, avec la nouvelle situation conjoncture au Moyen-Orient, l'État islamique de Syrie s'est mêlé dans la danse et il y a un aspect religieux donc dans le conflit de l'État. Alors heureusement, récemment, Kidal vient d'être réoccupé par les forces militaires et on pense que vraiment ça va être l'espoir de rebondir pour sauver cette situation. On a dit suffisamment. On est piégé par c'est des pays extrêmement riches. C'est des pays de l'or. C'est vraiment les pays de l'or, cette partie de l'Afrique. Et c'est des pays qui sont instrumentalisés par le franc CFA, qui est une fausse monnaie, qui n'est même pas une monnaie quelque part. Hein? Et à partir du moment où on est pris dans cette monnaie coloniale, il est extrêmement difficile de prétendre résoudre un certain nombre de problèmes de société. Et aujourd'hui, à Bamako, il n'y a pas d'électricité. C'est extraordinaire. Hein? Il n'y a pas d'électricité. On ne sait pas quand l'électricité vient ou ça ne part pas. Donc tout ça, à mon avis, sont des choses extrêmement riches et qui peuvent permettre de dire que les choses vont dans le bon sens. Et que c'est que le monopole de la violence de l'État sur un territoire, comme Max Weber le disait, c'est la grande question. Est-ce que nos États sont capables de gérer le territoire sur lequel ils sont? Exactement comme dans une famille, est-ce que vous êtes capable de gérer l'espace qui vous est confié? Tant qu'un État n'est pas à mesure de faire cela, il y a un problème. Et c'est pourquoi, aussi bien au Niger, au Mali et au Burkina, ce projet d'alliance des États est en cours. Pourquoi? Parce que l'État qu'on nous a donné, c'est un État postcolonial extraverti. J'ai longuement travaillé avec Samir Amin. J'étais son représentant au Mali. Il a beaucoup parlé de cette extraversion qui est connue et qui est entretenue. Entretenue d'ailleurs pour la plupart par des intellectuels qui en vivent. Hein, et les 80% de la population ne sont pas concernés par cette extraversion qu'on va appeler informelle. En fait, c'est eux qui sont le formel. Et c'est l'État qui est l'informel. Si on change le paradigme. Hein, si on change le paradigme, on va voir que ce qu'on appelle informel, c'est ça qui est le vrai formel, parce que c'est ça qui est la société productrice de biens et de services. Donc, l'État ne peut pas être présent. Il y a 22 millions de personnes. Comment l'État peut couvrir un territoire? La seule région de Caille et de Kidal est plus grande que tout le Sénégal. Et le Mali, c'est 1 200 000 km². Si on met ces trois pays ensemble, il y aura à peu près 3 millions de km², il y aura à peu près 70 millions d'habitants, et ça fait une unité. Le gros problème des Africains, c'est l'unité. On n'a jamais pu construire une unité. Donc c'est un problème qui nous concerne beaucoup plus nous-mêmes, hein, dans nos capacités endogènes, hein, d'arriver à un résultat. On ne peut pas toujours tout mettre sur le dos de l'esclavage, de la colonisation. Tout le monde a été colonisé. Les Juifs qui dominent aujourd'hui ont été colonisés 400 ans et demi en Égypte. Ça, on le sait. Donc vraiment, tout le monde est passé par l'esclavage quelque part. Mais chaque communauté asiatique, africaine ou européenne s'est retournée pour regarder dans ses propres capacités pour faire face. Ce n'est pas encore le cas de l'Afrique. Et ce n'est pas le cas de l'Afrique parce qu'au niveau conceptuel, on est en train d'être toujours dans les schémas des autres et on n'arrive pas. J'ai eu une expérience extraordinaire récemment. C'est d'avoir travaillé avec un imam faiseur de président de la République et de défaiseur, l'imam Diko, qui est connu. Je travaille avec lui 10 ans. C'est complètement un schéma différent. Et ça montre en quoi nos sociétés ont des ressources inimaginables, des capacités de rebondissement, mais qu'on ne soupçonne pas parce que nous sommes passés par un autre chemin. Hein. Et lui avait réussi justement à faire une mobilisation du milieu religieux qui n'existait pas dans la politique. Les gens ne votaient pas, les musulmans ne votaient pas. On est supposé être 90% de musulmans, mais la politique, c'était pour les autres. Donc, quelque part, ça veut dire que nos sociétés disposent de ressources extraordinaires et il nous revient à nos risques et périls de les accompagner dans ça. Et chaque fois que l'on prend ça, on prend des risques physiques, intellectuels, physiques, pour pouvoir faire ce travail. Et ça peut aboutir à des situations de martyrs que j'évoquais dans le cas de Omar Diop Blondin, que j'ai connu d'ailleurs à Paris. Donc, le problème de la souveraineté qu'on pose, c'est un problème de conception. C'est un problème de conceptuel. Tant que nous ne sommes pas aussi dans nos conceptions linguistiques, on l'a dit, l'autre jour, tant que nous ne sommes pas dans nos langues, hein, il est extrêmement difficile de faire, d'aboutir à cette conception. Alors, les défis, on les connaît. Moi, j'en ai cité très. Le premier défi, c'est la bonne gouvernance et la sécurité. C'est le problème de la réconciliation nationale. C'est le socio-économique, quatrièmement. C'est le problème de l'éducation et des ressources humaines, hein, qu'on n'a pas. C'est le chômage des jeunes. Hein. C'est également l'équité du genre. Et c'est la gestion unitaire de la diversité socio-culturelle qui est vraiment, ce sont ces éléments, en fait, qui provoquent l'insécurité. Hein, et je faisais de référence à la situation de Fitnat Akbar Minkat, l'insécurité est pire que la guerre. La guerre, c'est un petit moment. Hein. La guerre, c'est un petit moment, c'est un petit accident. Ça dure 10 ans, ça dure 20 ans, c'est l'insécurité au niveau de la société, au niveau de la gestion de la société qui fait qu'on aboutit à une guerre. Et tant qu'on ne règle pas ces questions-là, on sera permanemment dans cette situation conflictuelle que nous connaissons au Sahel et que nous, les intellectuels, nous sommes interpellés pour vraiment dire quel État faut-il pour nos pays. Ce n'est pas nos micro-États, à la limite, qui sont presque des hôtels particuliers avec des réceptionnistes comme président, vous m'excusez l'image caricaturale, hein, face à des empires, parce que la France est un empire. C'est un empire, ce n'est pas simplement un État, c'est un empire. Et aujourd'hui, vous regardez Gaza, le seul Erdogan qui puisse dire aux Israéliens, arrêtez-vous là, parce que Erdogan, c'est l'Empire ottoman. Hein? L'Iran, c'est l'Empire perse. Donc, quand on restreint au niveau de l'État, on ne voit pas le background qui peut donner positionnement à un État ou à un autre. Donc, on est dans une guerre, on dit mondialisation, impérialisation, etc. C'est quand même des logiques d'ensemble qui font une force aujourd'hui. Et dans le passé. Et aujourd'hui et dans le passé. Est-ce que nous sommes en mesure de nous construire dans l'unité étatique? Voilà la question, et de sortir de nos petits schémas tranquilles là en disant j'ai mon drapeau, j'ai mon hymne, je marche comme ça. Non, tu vas nulle part. Parce que ceux qui sont en face de toi, hein, ils savent déjà que tu es vraiment à la limite un réceptionniste dans un grand hôtel particulier où ils aiment bien de temps en temps se promener. Donc vraiment, est-ce qu'on a des États? Et on ne peut avoir de ça que quand on arrive à poser ces questions. C'est un vieux combat. C'est un combat transversal, c'est un combat panafricain, c'est un combat de toute la diaspora, c'est un combat de tous les afro-descendants. Cette unité de l'Afrique derrière laquelle on court et qui est la seule issue ne peut se faire que quand nous sortons de nos propres égoïsmes intellectuels et arriver vraiment à dire Il n'y a pas de possibilité d'être quelque chose si je ne suis pas avec l'autre. Et c'est vraiment sur cette note d'espoir que je pense que le combat qui est là entre des élections toujours contestées et des coups d'État répétitifs, c'est vraiment dans le petit milieu des agents fonctionnaires de l'État. La masse, hein, elle a d'autres préoccupations. Elle peut traverser la Méditerranée ou le Sahara. Il y a des problèmes de fond, alors qu'on est sur des ressources les plus riches du monde. Donc vraiment, on est des hommes, on a des limites. Il y a un créateur. Moi, je suis dans cet état-là. Je fais appel à Dieu, que Dieu nous assiste, en tout cas, par sa miséricorde, qu'il nous pardonne et qu'on puisse être ensemble et qu'on ne s'enferme pas dans des schémas conceptuels qui ne sont pas les nôtres. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I titled my talk for this afternoon as The Poisoned Chalice of Militarism and a Coup d'etat in Africa. I would be remiss, though, not to thank the Council, especially the Secretariat, the able leadership of the indefatigable Comrade Dr. Godwin Murunga. Running this incredibly important Pan-African institution is arguably one of the toughest jobs in our scholarly profession. And managing the logistics of bringing together a large gathering of African scholars is undoubtedly a daunting operation. We therefore must salute Dr. Murunga and his team at the Secretariat and CODESRIA's Executive Committee for the terrific job they have done. The theme of this panel is militarisms. The plural militarisms suggests varieties of the military and military power in Africa. But how do we define what militarism means? In my work, I have adopted Ami Otuno's definition of militarism as the subordination of societal processes, institutions, and agendas to the objectives of the military and the use of military means for upward socio-economic mobility, accession to political power, and survival of social groups. In the main, militarism is a major legacy of colonialism. We should recall that the African colonial state was founded on militarism, and the use, or at a minimum, the threat of coercion and violence mediated relations between the colonists and the colonized peoples. The colonial state was essentially a military state, forcefully created and anchored on the use of brute force in its various guises, but especially in the form of military coups. Militarism has remained an enduring feature of post-colonial Africa. Military coups in Africa tend to attract inordinate attention, especially from the Western media and academia, with a gaze as ever keen to report the dramatic and the sensational that comes out of the African continent. On its page cover, for example, of January 1984, Time magazine summarized the African continent as, quote, coups, conflict, and corruption. And more recently, on 31st January 2023, the New York Times ran a headline, quote, 5 African countries, 6 coups. And similarly, The Economist on 9th October 2023 wondered, and I quote, where will the next coup be in Africa? In our academic circles, there is a litany of stylized attempts at making sense of the recent wave of coups as reflecting a return to the expected normalcy of African politics. In other words, for the Western media and academia, the coup, much like armed conflict, is Africa's bizarre fate. We are told the coup epidemic, in quotes, has returned to the continent with a big bang, seen in what some have characterized as the coup belt across the Sahel and West Africa, starting with the August 2022 coup in Mali against President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, followed in 2021 with the coups in Chad, Mali, again for the second time, Guinea-Conakry, and Sudan. And in 2022, in Burkina Faso, twice in January and September, and in 2023, in Niger, and most recently, in Gabon. These coincidences have led many to suggest that there is a return to the old era of coups d'etat. Yet, that suggestion, I argue, betrays a lack of historical perspective and a proper grasp of the oversized roles of the military and militarism in Africa's political processes writ large. The claim of the return of the coup in and of itself says little about the causes and the triggers of coups. It also says little about the fluctuations of that phenomenon. For the most part, during the 2010s, the count of successful military coups on the continent was actually trending downwards, a trajectory that appeared to point towards an emergent coup taboo. As Isaka Suare persuasively argued in a 2014 article in the journal Modern African Studies, since the adoption of the Lomé Convention, a normative standard had taken root, with the African Union playing the role of a norm entrepreneur. I'll provide some quick historical context to frame the discussion. Egypt registered Africa's first military coup d'etat in 1952, followed by Sudan in 1958. And further south across to West Africa, the bloody overthrow of President Olympio in Togo in 1963 became the bookend to an unfolding wave. And when the men in khaki turned on President Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana in 1966, the reverberations rang louder across the continent and indeed around the world. For Dr. Nkrumah was not just the doyen of Africa's struggle for liberation, he was also the chief architect of a united African continent. His regional and international reputation, though, as the foremost Pan-Africanist of the time, did little to save him. His overthrow was a clear harbinger of what lay ahead for the continent. By the end of the 1970s, there had been a staggering more than 40 successful military coups with a revolving door-like regularity of soldiers overthrowing soldiers, as happened in Benin, where in just 10 years, that country had experienced 5 successful military coups. At the end of the 1980s, most African states had experienced at least one successful coup, with several repeat cases like Benin, Burkina Faso, and Nigeria, each with at least 6 successful coups. In much of the Africanist literature then, the question became not why coups occur, but rather why a few countries had avoided them, or why those that had experienced them had managed to overcome their reoccurrence. And this became captured in the notion of coup-proofing. A central figure of militarism, I argue, over the decades of post-independent Africa was how, after overthrowing civilian leaders, uniformed men turned on overthrowing each other in coups and counter-coups, palace coups, and coups of descending order. In Burkina Faso, Ghana, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, among others, the generals that overthrew civilian incumbents were themselves in turn taken out by disgruntled junior officers, lieutenants and captains. The Ghanaian experience here is actually quite instructive. The overthrow of Dr. Nkrumah in 1966 introduced a coup culture that afflicted Ghana for a very long, painful time. Having overthrown Dr. Nkrumah, and after a brief return to civilian democratic rule in 1969, President Kofi Busia was overthrown in 1972 by Lieutenant Colonel Ignatius Achampo, who in turn was overthrown in 1978 palace coup by his deputy, General Frederick Ekufo, only for General Ekufo himself to be overthrown months later by a junior officer's coup in June 1979. The late 1970s and early 1980s were tempestuous times for Ghana. Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings, who with others had mutinied in May 1979 and got arrested and condemned to death for attempting to overthrow the military junta, the Supreme Military Council #2, then turned the screws as he awaited execution. A small group of junior officers daringly freed Rawlings, who then went on to announce the overthrow of General Ekufo's government and declared a new government under the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, AFRC. The AFRC then went on rampage. It was called house cleaning. In what was arguably the most extreme and chilling public act, the smaller boys running the show in Ghana at the time against the big men publicly executed half a dozen senior army officers, including 3 former heads of state, Generals Ekufo, Achampo, and Ekwasi Afrifa. Allegedly, the big men in the army and their civilian counterparts had visited so much wrong on the country through corruption, abuse of power, runaway malfeasance, such that there was a need for an operation of exorcism. The corrupted socio-economic environment that had eaten up Ghana at the time went by the popular local name Kalabule. The mantra of the moment, given moral currency and credibility by a controversial Catholic priest, the Reverend Kwabena Vincent Damois, was let the blood flow. And the blood did flow. For what it was worth then, elections were swiftly held at the end of 1979, and the new civilian president, Dr. Hilary Ma, took over, only to be overthrown on the last day of 1981 in what was Jerry Rawlings' second coming, under a new junta name, the Provisional National Defense Council. It was another junior officers' coup in Ghana for the second time, and it ended Ghana's short-lived Third Republic. Junior officers overthrowing not just civilian governments, but the entire political establishment, including the extant military hierarchy, became somewhat of a model trend across West Africa, in Liberia, in Burkina Faso, and most infamously in Sierra Leone, where in 1992, Captain Valentine Strasser became the world's youngest head of state, aged only 25, perhaps clueless what to do with the power and responsibility of being president. At any rate, the painful experience of numerous coups and failed coups in Ghana, especially at the end of the 1970s and early 1980s, appears to have entrenched an anti-coup norm that held firm among Ghanaians. Today, Ghana runs on, as many of us know, a precarious quasi-liberal democracy characterized by citizens' disillusionment at the failed promises of democracy, elite corruption, alternation of power between two parties with little socio-economic transformation. However, the average Ghanaian, and indeed members of the armed forces, is unlikely to view a military takeover as a necessary remedy. Instead, Ghana's armed forces has transformed from being orchestrators of coups to defenders of a civilian political settlement. In many African countries, nearly every successful coup receives a rapturous public celebration from citizens desperate for better government and accountable leadership. But a careful assessment shows that coups have hurt more than they have helped Africa and the quest for good government and accountable leadership. The record of military rulers and militarism is deeply appalling and hardly worth celebrating. Throughout Africa's post-independence period, military rulers have been as bad, if not entirely more atrocious, than when we have had civilians in charge. It is hard to argue, therefore, that when civilian leadership fails, coups are the solution. For beyond opening up opportunities for few elites in the armed forces to snatch state power, coups are a dubious solution to civilian governance failures. In the main then, the coup d'etat, while enticing and clutched on by African masses clamoring for change, mostly has been a poisoned chalice. Coups have been little more than power grabs by self-seeking military actors, often egged on by opportunistic civilian allies. Individuals and groups who seize power through conspiratorial machinations, which is what coups are about, and the force of arms are hardly different from civilians who rig elections or who use both legal and extra-legal maneuvers to keep state power. Throughout the African continent and during the post-independent era, there have been few African countries where the military has not had an oversized role or where military actors are not key political players, even when the top leadership is civilian. That is to say, whether or not whoever is at the top is draped in military fatigues or dons business suits, the armed forces have been prominent, in fact, the most consequential actors in the politics of most independent African states. The oversized role of the military has been mostly destructive and destabilizing, neither in the containment of public crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic, nor in the governance of state affairs writ large has the military's dominant place made particularly positive contributions to building and strengthening civilian institutions and systems of governance. Even where African militaries have not been overtly, where African militaries have not overtly overthrown civilian rulers through coups, the uniformed personnel, nevertheless, and their corporate interests have tended to influence political processes indirectly, including determining election outcomes, aiding dubious constitutional amendments like the removal of term limits, and helping in the entrenchment of incumbents who commit human rights violations on behalf, and the militaries have also committed human rights violations on behalf of civilian politicians. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that the egregious behavior of the military goes beyond the coup d'etat. This is the message of a book I co-edited and published last year on civil-military relations in Africa with the subtitle, Beyond the Coup d'etat. While the book's subtitle has a question mark, the core argument we advanced is that we need to move beyond the focus and the obsession of the military coups in order to decipher the broader spectrum of the roles, often less obvious but nevertheless insidious, that the military and militarism plays in African politics. Coups are dramatic and make for salacious media reporting and screaming headlines. They also make for fanciful scholarly formulations that underscore the supposed perverse ways of African politics as seen from the Western academic gaze. However, coups on their own do not tell us the full story of the role of the armed forces in African politics and society. In the above-mentioned book that I co-edited last year, we argued that coups had been such a common phenomenon for most of the first decade of post-independence Africa, but given that since at least the mid-2000s, they were on the decline, it was somewhat sterile to remain fixated on coups. Oh, okay. All right, Chair tells me that my time is almost up, so I'll give some quick concluding reflections. In momentous circumstances and the desperation for change, and in the heat of triumphalism, there is often a rush to celebrate military coups. However, such celebrations betray a lack of historical context and a proper grasp of the role of the armed forces in post-independent Africa. Coups have scarcely been solutions to the problems Africa faces, whether socio-economic or political. If anything, coups and other forms of militarism tend to exacerbate rather than mitigate security challenges and socio-political instability. Take, for example, Burkina Faso. The junior officers who overthrew President Christian Kabore in 2022 faulted him for failing to assure security and stability in the face of jihadist insurgency. But the insurgency, and especially attacks against civilians, worsened following the coup. The situation is hardly different in Mali and Niger, where military juntas overthrew civilian governments in the face of deteriorating security situations. The military juntas in Mali and Niger have done precious little to improve the security situation in both countries. The bottom line then is that military coups have tended to weaken rather than strengthen African state systems. And lastly, even though military makers justify their actions in the rhetoric of democracy, military rulers and military governments have had a clear record of brutality and anti-democratic behavior. The coup culture and military authoritarian behavior have done more to contribute to entrenching militarism and the ethos of the gun than to empower African civil society to promote accountable civilian authority. I thank you very much for your kind audience.
Thanks very much, Moses. We'll now hear from Shadrack for a few words.
Je connais français un peu. Mais français, c'est très difficile pour moi. So much as I would like to make my comments in French, practicalities dictate I speak in English. Now, I have read Moses' paper. I have read Isaac's paper, which is not presented. I have only listened to Hamidou's paper. It was not available on the website. And so I'm going to make my comments on the three papers, even though Isaac's paper has not been presented. I was prepared to make those comments. And here's what I'm going to do. Number one, I want to comment on the main arguments made by the presenters. Number two, I want to raise just one question for each of them. And then number three, I want to comment on the thread that ties the papers together and problematize the thread. So first of all, I want to applaud Moses for the definition he adopts in his paper, which actually ties together all the papers in his definition of what militarism means. He adopts a definition that says militarism means the subordination of societal processes, institutions, and agendas to the objectives of the military, and the use of military means for upward socioeconomic mobility, accession to political power, and survival of social groups, which captures the essence of the focus of his own paper on military coups. It captures the focus of Hamidou's paper on the crisis of instability in Mali, and captures Isaac's focus on terrorist movements in West Africa and the Sahel. Now, in terms of Moses' paper, Militarism in Contemporary Africa, the poisoned chalice of militarism and the coup d'etat in Africa, his main argument is that every successful coup on the continent is received with jubilation by citizens of the countries in which those coups take place, mainly because of the quest by those citizens for good governance. But he argues that all these coups have hurt more than they have helped Africa's quest for better governance and accountable leadership. And that they have done so because they tend to exacerbate rather than mitigate security challenges and socio-political instability. Those are his conclusions. My question is, maybe let me summarize the others before I ask the questions. Hamidou Magassa's paper, his main argument, he focuses on the crisis of instability in Mali, which he blames on issues of governance. That if governance was okay, then things will be right. And because of lack of proper governance, you have this crisis of instability that is a major source of insecurity in the country, and his Mali risks the danger of even disappearing as a state. And so his recommendation is about issues of governance and a call to African unity. In terms of Isaac's paper, his main argument is that COVID-19 actually boosted the capacity of terrorist groups in West Africa and the Sahel and helped them escalate the violence in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger and in Nigeria. Why? He argues that the state withdrew the forces that were engaged in counterinsurgency and redeployed them to enforce lockdown measures that the government was taking, and therefore left the terrorist groups on their own in terms of facilitating their activities in a big way. He argues that the major problem that has faced the counterinsurgency measures in this region is the crisis of legitimacy of the states that are involved, and the lack of political will to actually redefine strategies for effective counterinsurgency measures. Now, returning to one question for each of the two presenters here, Moses really argues that the coup has been a poisoned chalice, and that it has never helped issues of governance, issues of democracy, socio-economic development, and so on. But here is a question I want to ask. And this question is not just for Moses, it's for all of us to consider. What about the coup in Burkina Faso that brought to power a man called Thomas Sankara? Was it really a poisoned chalice? Do we have exceptions in terms of military leaders who have actually done well? What is the balance if you measure the performance of military governments in terms of the positive and the negative? In my view, the case study that Moses focuses on, Ghana, the leadership of Jerry Rawlings, in my estimation, on balance, it was more positive than it was negative. In the case of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo may have taken power from the assassination of Murtala Muhammad, who had taken power by a coup, but he organized a return to elective politics. General Abubakar may have taken over from Babangida as a military leader, but he organized a return to elective politics that actually brought to power Olusegun Obasanjo as the first elected president in this multi-party era. Thomas Sankara, for me, he came to power via military coup. But in my estimation, perhaps there is no transformational leader on the African continent better than Thomas Sankara. In a period of 4 years, he transformed Burkina Faso. He empowered women. He actually, the first act he made when he came to power was to slash the salary of the president and the ministers and top civil servants, and to sell off a contingent of Mercedes-Benz cars, and decided the Renault will be the official car for Burkina Faso. He even declared that the officials traveling abroad will not travel first class. They will travel economy. And he argued that whether you are in first class or in economy class, when the plane takes off, we all take off. When it lands, we all land. Very revolutionary, very transformational. So is it true that all military coups are a poisoned chalice? The question for Hamidou is, you have decried really the crisis of instability in Mali and the problems of governance. And Isaac mentions along the same lines the idea that most of those governments that are facing this crisis of instability have a crisis of legitimacy. Now, what do we do about that? What strategies do we put in place to address the crisis of legitimacy among these African states? I will invite Moses, I will invite the presenters to perhaps also consult Ali Mazrui's ideas about coups. In a book published in 2006, I think it is called The Two Africas, Nigeria and South Africa as contrasting visions. He argues that the political history of the continent proves that there are countries that are actually coup-prone, and there are those that are coup-proof. And that the coup-proof countries tend to lie south of the equator. Coup-prone countries tend to lie north of the equator. That is Mazrui's words, not mine. And so perhaps we may consult that and try to see, perhaps, what is it among countries that are coup-proof that can be extracted and applied to those that are coup-prone in order to mitigate the question of coups. Finally, my final comment is that the papers, again, are tied together by this focus on the question of security. But what this raises is whose security? Whose security? All those papers tied together by the theme of security and the crisis of instability. The specter of terrorism in West Africa and the Sahel that Isaaca's paper addresses, that Hamidou's paper addresses, coups and counter-coups, some of them justified on the basis of lack of security, and then the subsequent violations of human rights by military leaders. But the question is whose security, and security from what? In my view, we need to broaden the conceptualization of security, because the incumbent governments conceptualize security in terms of the security of the state, in terms of the security of the political leaders. But we need to go beyond that, deepen it to the security of livelihoods, to the security of the physical security of individual citizens that Hamidou has so eloquently portrayed, to the security of institutions, and so on and so forth. If we do not do so, then we are not doing a good service. So let me stop there. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Shadrack Nasongo, for discussing Professor Hamidou Magassa's paper and also Moses Khisa's paper. So very happy that we were able to get the bulletin in which both articles, but also the other ones that I've mentioned are being published. I think everybody will get a free copy, and I would encourage you to read the very nuanced readings of the particular moment that the region is experiencing. I particularly like Prof. Magassa's attempt to give us a longer history of Mali's attempt to build a stable state. And I'm not trying in any way to summarize what has already been discussed by Shadrack, but Prof. Magassa tells us that what is at stake now is really what has been at stake over the past 60 years. And it is about economics and well-being, it's about rights and freedom, it's about sovereignty and popular participation, it's about democracy and legitimacy. So it is really the stuff of state building, but at the current moment under conditions of insecurity. In the paper published here by Moses, he gives us a very nuanced reading that also encourages people to go beyond a binary reading between military rule and civil rule, between democracy and autocratic rule, in the sense that our understanding of state consolidation, based on the idea that the state has to be defined by a clear separation between what is supposed to be the military opposed to the civilian, is quite simplistic. And in fact, in most African states, including those that have not experienced a coup d'etat, the role of the military has always been very important. So the question would be now for us to try and understand why that is the case. So I guess I would like to open the floor for a few questions, and I would like to invite everybody to be very concise in their question, and then that will give us a little bit of time to think about the two questions asked by the discussant to the two speakers. So Mshai in the front, and then the gentleman in the back, and I can't see you because of the light. The lady in red.
just want to really thank the panel and the discussant. This is such a great way of thinking about militarisms. I kept wondering, which is the pandemic, the coup or the oppressive state that many Africans experience as the norm? And so I'm not sure if it's a question. I just would like to hear the participants, having heard each other, because it seems to me they're making the two sides of the case, to reflect on what the other person's presentation has given them to think about. Because I think what the discussant has done, and I was smiling as he was saying it because that was what I'd put in my notes, that this takes us back to the need for a deeper engagement on the question of the state, the relationship between state and society, not just in Africa, but in the world in general. And what happens when we center the question of security, not of the state, not of the elite, not even by saying the question of the people in a general way, but by centering the security of the most vulnerable in the ways that we've been talking about. Today we've talked about vulnerability and inequalities, and we're all thinking about Gaza and other spaces. So for me, it's not just an African question. I think it is a question for the world. So thank you very much for giving us so much to think about.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. Military coup in Africa is something that cuts across the interests of every discipline because it affects the entire continent. So you don't necessarily need to be a historian to find interest in the military coup. A quick one, it is argued that the military coup is not a solution to African economy. I don't know what you can say about that, since it impedes democracy. Secondly, the military coup in Gabon, is it a window dressing? Because France has maintained sealed lips as compared to its agitation in Mali, as compared to what happened in Mali. Was it spearheaded by the cankerworm in Africa, that is the France? And thirdly, how far are we sure that Russia is going to act differently from France? Because I see Mali getting too close to Russia in terms of their relationship, new relationship. So how far are we sure that Russia is not going to be the same like France? Thank you very much.
Merci aux différents panélistes de nous avoir autant enrichis. J'ai une question qui est directement adressée au professeur Magassa. J'ai beaucoup appris. C'est vrai que dans ses propos, il a utilisé le mot caricature. Lorsqu'il parlait de nos États comme étant des hôtels pour l'Occident. Mais j'aimerais bien le relancer sur cette question-là, sur cette problématique, en demandant, peut-on réellement considérer dans nos États africains comme des simples hôtels, comme vous avez dit, comme une simple caisse de résonance pour l'Occident? En d'autres termes aussi, est-ce que les formes prises par nos États au lendemain de la colonisation, mais aussi suivant les différentes constructions historiques par lesquelles nos sociétés sont passées pendant la période précoloniale, affirmer les choses telles que vous l'avez fait, n'est-il pas une façon de légitimer ou alors de nier le rôle des forces en interne dans la formation de nos sociétés telles qu'elles se présentent aujourd'hui, que ces forces-là soient militaire, qu'elle soit culturelle, qu'elle soit sociale, ne pensez-vous pas que les choses auraient été différentes si tout se serait limité à une simple caisse de résonance? Merci.
Oui, je remercie les panélistes pour leur contribution, mais je reviens au lien entre le militarisme et les pandémies. On l'a vu dans le cas d'Ebola, en Afrique de l'Ouest, Sierra Leone, Libéria, Guinée. On a recouru aux militaires pour arriver à gérer un peu ce qui se passait dans ces trois pays. Comment est-ce que les panélistes, tous les deux qui sont là, se positionnent par rapport au recours aux militaires durant les pandémies? Merci.
Hello, I'm Hannah, and I thank the panel. I very much look forward to reading the papers. And this is a genuine question for Professor Khisa, because I haven't read the paper. So could you tell me how you define the success of a coup? Is there a particular time period, and how do you counterpose that to the alternative of not having one? Thank you.
Thank you very much, the panelists and CODESRIA, for reflecting on this very current and interesting theme. I think the theme on militarism is one that is emerging as a current pandemic within the African continent. My name is Peter Wekesa from Kenyatta University, and my two reflections, I think, are tied to the question that the discussant, Professor Nasong'o, raised. The Mazurui question on the divide between the North and the South, one region considered to be coup-proof, and the other region considered to be coup-prone. The emerging reality, and which I really want the other panelists to comment on, is the East-West divide and the argument behind the civilian vis-a-vis military coups. Because in as much as we have discussed so much about military coups, less and less discussions are emerging around civilian coups, and there's an intersection which I think we need to emphasize on. I really want some comment on that. Secondly, it's about the interventions. I was reading a recent article by a leading historian in Africa, Professor Toyin Falola, on the ECOWAS intervention in the case of the West African coups. And he made a very captivating comment on ECOWAS democracy. And he referred to it as a democracy by politicians for politicians. I think we need to begin looking at ways in which we are intervening in dealing with a military problem, and wanted to invite the panelists to also reflect on the ways in which the states, mainly through the regional blocs, have been attempting to intervene and deal with this question of militarism and military coups. Thank you so much.
Merci à tous les panélistes. Moi, je suis Aboubakar Maman. Je viens des États-Unis, je suis professeur là, à Rhodes College, avec le professeur Nasong'o, qui est le discutant cet après-midi. Moi, je suis originairement du Togo. Donc, je suis né dans un pays où je n'ai connu que deux présidents, depuis 1967. Alors, le premier président est venu au pouvoir à la suite d'un coup d'État, comme l'a évoqué mon collègue de la droite là-bas. Alors, et ce qui m'inquiète personnellement, c'est l'euphorie que nous vivons dans les rues après les coups d'État, notamment au Mali, au Burkina Faso, où nous avons vu les jeunes célébrer avec l'armée dans les rues, en tenant les drapeaux, soit du Burkina ou du Mali, avec celui de la Russie. Une collègue avait déjà fait cette intervention, on attend la réponse. Alors, je me dis, mais qu'est-ce que nous célébrons? Est-ce que nous célébrons la libération ou bien nous célébrons la Russie? Voilà. Donc, avons-nous besoin des institutions fortes ou bien des hommes forts? Merci.
Thank you very much for those questions. So we're going to start with Prof. Magassa. Je vous inviterai à prendre les questions qui vous intéressent, parce qu'il y en a beaucoup en fait.
OK.
Et la question de la Russie est revenue 2 ou 3 fois, donc je pense que ce serait intéressant de dire 2 ou 3 mots là-dessus.
Extrêmement intéressant. Je crois qu'il faut sortir des schémas, des clichés. Et le partenariat est mondial. Notre partenariat n'est pas seulement occidental, ni français, ni américain. Vous savez, l'histoire du Mali, c'est la tentative avec le Sénégal de faire une fédération. Et je rappelais qu'au mois d'août, cette fédération a éclaté parce que De Gaulle ne la voulait pas. C'est clair, elle est assez documentée. Donc le Mali, depuis 1960, est en contact avec la Russie. La plupart des cadres du Mali ont été formés en Russie, notamment le Premier ministre actuel. Je veux dire, de toute notre génération. Moi, j'ai 76 ans, donc Dieu merci, j'ai connu le colon, j'ai connu toutes les républiques. Et donc, ce n'est pas une histoire de Russie ou d'Amérique. Et puis, quand vous parlez de les institutions fortes ou les hommes forts, là, ça me fait penser à ce que Obama disait, quoi. C'est plus compliqué que ça. L'Afrique, la construction de l'Afrique, c'est fait aussi par des individus, par des relations d'homme à homme. C'est ça aussi notre défaut et notre qualité. Ce n'est pas les États-Unis. On a un modèle de démocratie, et j'y ai participé, qui est complètement, qui passe à côté, qui est complètement scolarisé, qui est complètement enfermé dans des schémas d'opposition ou de majorité. Et d'ailleurs, on ne sait pas qui est majorité, qui est autorité, des choses là-dedans. Et il y a 300 partis, 400 partis, je ne sais pas combien de candidats, mais arrêtons. Arrêtons avec les modèles. Le problème, c'est nous-mêmes. Créons notre propre modèle, réfléchissons sur nos sociétés et les dynamiques qu'elles ont eues pour créer une stabilité avant la colonisation. C'est ça le problème. Et c'est ça notre fonction à nous, de dire nous faisons partie de la modernité à partir de ce que notre héritage a donné. Alors quand des gens, le cas du Mali, je l'ai personnellement suivi, ce n'est pas une histoire de drapeau simplement. Parce que les gens ont été déçus de la France, qui a complètement manipulé la situation après ce qu'elle a fait en Libye, et elle a voulu créer un État à Kidal pour des Touaregs qui ne représentent qu'1% de la population. Et le recours à la Russie, et on a eu 10 ans de Barkhane au Mali, 10 ans, et presque des touristes. On a eu également la MINUSMA, 10 ans, presque des touristes. Ils vont vous dire qu'ils ont perdu 50 soldats. Mais les Maliens meurent tous les jours. Nous, on ne compte pas. Donc, quelque part, notre problème, je veux dire, c'est un problème de productivité scientifique, académique. C'est ça qui va sauver l'Afrique. Pas un modèle russe, pas un modèle chinois, pas un modèle américain. C'est ça notre gros problème. Donc le Mali, les Chinois sont au Mali depuis 60 ans. On ne les a pas découverts maintenant. Ça, c'était la réponse au dernier intervenant et la libération. La libération, tout le monde est dans la libération. Hein. Chacun croit qu'il libère quelque chose. En fait, il se libère lui-même, quoi. C'est un mot facile. Sortons des mots, quoi. La deuxième chose que je peux dire, qui est une très bonne question, effectivement, le problème de l'État, Le monsieur, le deuxième intervenant, la dame qui a parlé au premier sur Gaza, effectivement, c'est clair. Elle a donné un bon commentaire que je partage. Le cas du Gabon, c'est clair, c'est un coup d'État sur commande. Le cas du Mali, c'est la société civile musulmane qui a fait amener les militaires au pouvoir aujourd'hui. Ils le disent d'ailleurs, ils n'ont fait que parachever. Il y a eu 10 ans de dynamique sous Ibeka, qui est un collègue, il est passé totalement à côté, complètement manipulé par Hollande. Et il est arrivé au pouvoir par l'entremise de la mobilisation de la société civile musulmane. À 77%, et il est passé totalement à côté. Puis à son âme, hein. Je ne sais pas comment il va se débrouiller là-bas. Et vous avez vu cet imam-là, cet imam Diko. Moi, je travaille avec lui 10 ans. Je peux dire, il connaît le Coran, moi je connais l'État. On s'est mis ensemble. On s'est séparés maintenant, d'ailleurs, je pense qu'on ne se retrouvera pas. Et Dieu merci. Et parce qu'on est dans des logiques, et ils n'ont pas d'ambition d'État. C'est des entrepreneurs religieux, comme vous trouvez ici au Sénégal. Des gens qui donnent des votes et qui vivent d'une rente d'État, qui n'ont pas de projet. Ils ont un projet par rapport à eux-mêmes. Donc, un scientifique, tu ne peux pas, tu peux marcher avec ceci et t'arrêter. Les militaires qui sont là, ils sont là à la suite vraiment de cette dynamique sociale, du réveil d'une société civile musulmane qu'on pensait avoir disparu. Et donc, ça pose le problème de quel État on a. Parce que l'État qu'on a, ce n'est pas notre État. C'est un État postcolonial formé par une armée qui était une armée chère à canon. Oui. Et donc, le réflexe des militaires qui font des coups d'État, c'est se protéger. Ils n'ont pas de culture, en tout cas, de faire une gouvernance dans le sens de sécuriser dans les domaines que nous attendons tous, avoir de bonnes routes. Moi, je viens à Bamako, à Paris, à Dakar en 1 heure, 1 heure et demie. Ma fille vient de quitter Dakar. Elle me dit, je mets 2 jours pour aller à Bamako, je mets 2 jours pour revenir. Il n'y a pas de route, il n'y a pas d'électricité, il n'y a rien. Et ce n'est pas les militaires qui peuvent régler ça. C'est plus compliqué que ça. Donc, mais c'est une crise et il faut quand même régler. C'est une question chirurgicale. Je vais finir un peu. J'ai fait la caricature parce que vraiment, c'est mon sentiment. On est floué et on aime être floué. Le problème des Africains, c'est ça, on aime ça. Donc, on va le payer. Et on ne peut pas avoir de stabilité avec des gens qui se font élire n'importe comment et qui restent au pouvoir 1 mandat, 2 mandats, 3 mandats éternellement. Ça ne va pas. Il y a un problème de la démocratie. Démocratie, c'est un mot facile. On a, nous aussi, notre démocratie. Cherchons là, et peut-être que nous trouverons un moyen de stabiliser l'État comme on arrive plus ou moins à stabiliser nos familles. Plus ou moins, même si on est en crise de famille, on a plus de succès à ce niveau qu'au niveau de l'État. Et il faut savoir pourquoi. Je vais m'arrêter parce que ça risque d'être un peu long. CEDEAO, bon. CEDEAO, c'est vraiment une catastrophe. Vous voyez, ils ne font que sanctionner. Ils nous ont mis 6 mois, ils coupent les vivres. Ça se fait, ça. C'est humain. Et ça s'appelle politique parce que Macron donne des ordres. Non, arrêtons 5 minutes, quoi. Et chacun va payer. Chacun paye déjà. En haut ou en bas. Merci.
Thank you very much. Prof. Moses, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to Shadrack, the discussant, and thank you to the audience for very thoughtful and probing questions for us to reflect on. Let me begin by sort of clarifying where I stand, normatively speaking. After years trying to study the place and the role of the armed forces in African politics and society, my remarks here and what I wrote in the bulletin draws on sort of trying to understand the broader, the big picture. And the big picture for me is that the armed forces are a double-edged sword. The military can be a tool for good, but also a tool for destruction. When you study the African experience since independence, the picture that becomes clear is that the armed forces have for the most part, been a negative force. In a sense, I'm responding to Shadrack's question about, are there exceptions? I'm trying to look at the sum total. There, of course, in everything, there are exceptions. You know, there are going to be a few cases where, you know, a coup happens and some good comes out of it. But when you look at the sum total, the big picture, and with a long perspective, and you pull everything together, you see that the picture doesn't look good. Thomas Sankara, you know, that you referenced Shadrack, is an interesting case. You know, he comes and seen as a serious change maker, but because of the coup culture, he himself gets overthrown in a coup. Right. So he comes into power through a coup. He gets overthrown by a coup. So the point here is that coups beget coups. You know, you have a coup culture. Once it's laid down, it becomes an enduring feature. It becomes something ingrained in the fabric of the society, of the public. And that has not helped Africa. You know, if you look at, I mean, the point I'm making really is that Africa has had a fair share of military coups. And if we were to benefit from coups, we should be in a much better place than we are. Instead, you know, actually, if you look at the countries on the continent that have had the most coups, they are also the countries that still face the biggest share of problems. And countries like in Southern Africa, to your question, which somebody else also mentioned about the divide between the North and the South. If you look at Southern Africa, that has had the least coup counts, it's also, you know, the part of the continent that fares better in terms of, you know, governance indices and, you know, socioeconomic measures. So, you know, the bottom line of all this is that while in some cases there have been coups that people think are justifiable, for the most part, the men in uniform, the men in khaki, have been accessories and tools of misgovernance. And even when, and this is an important point we make in the book I was referencing, even when the generals are not overthrowing civilian politicians, they are actually influencing politics and society in wrong directions from behind, because for many African countries, the armed forces have such power, they call the strings. So they don't even have to overthrow governments. They do influence things in all sorts of ways that haven't helped our continent. That's sort of, you know, where I stand, not just normatively speaking, but also from sort of the work I've been doing. And then there was a question about the deeper engagement with the question of the state. Absolutely, you know, I agree with that. You know, whose security and what security? Again, you know, the armed forces have sort of been the fulcrum of the African state. You know, a lot of what has gone wrong has had some involvement of one form or the other of the armed forces. And then somebody was asking, you know, are military coups the solution? I think in some ways I've answered that. For the most part, they have not been the solution, because, you know, you end up with cycles of military takeovers that, you know, have not advanced the fundamental problems, have not responded to the fundamental problems that we face. And you see in a country like Gabon, which again somebody was alluding to, it's a window dressing, because essentially the general who overthrew the Gabonese president, Bongo, is a family member. So power has remained in the family. You have a coup, the guy who led the coup is a cousin of Bongo. You know, so, you know, you have a change of face at the top, but I don't think the system of misrule and bad governance in Gabon is going to change, because, you know, it's a recycling of the elites in the armed forces. And this has been the case in many other African countries that have had interventions by the armed forces. I mean, I don't know whether I still have a minute to respond to a couple of other questions.
Sure.
Okay, sure. Okay, thanks. Somebody raised an interesting question about the role of the armed forces in responding to pandemics like COVID. And in some ways, the initial motivation of writing this paper came out of trying to make sense of how armed forces in Africa are used in situations of crisis and emergence, particularly epidemics, and then most recently the COVID pandemic. So this sort of ties into the issue of securitization, and COVID was highly securitized pandemic, not just in Africa, but around the world. And African countries where the armed forces have such a prominent role had the armed forces at the forefront of COVID response. Did that help? I mean, in some ways, it definitely made a difference, because, you know, in a number of our African countries, a lot of resources, government resources, are in the hands of the military and the armed forces. So, you know, they can do certain things that other civilian institutions are not able to do. But the problem, though, is the reliance of the armed forces to do things that civilian institutions should do means that the civilian institutions don't get empowered, all right? The health ministries, the ministries of disaster response and that kind of stuff remained sidelined in the context of militarization and securitization. And that does not help in building stronger governing systems and institutions of civilian authority, which to me would be more accountable to the public than the armed forces are. And then I'll just respond, Ami, to one question or two, and then I'll stop. Somebody was asking about counting what passes for a successful coup. So in the literature, and you know, you could look this up, but there is sort of some cutoff point. The army or section of the army announces that they have overthrown a government. Of course, they have to effectively take over the government for it to be a successful coup. There are some gray cases, gray areas where it's, you know, neither fully successful nor a failed attempt at overthrowing a sitting government. But, you know, there has to be a certain cutoff point in terms of how long those who have announced they have overthrown a government are actually able to hold on if they are not pushed back. In some stylized quantitative analysis, you know, there has been an attempt to say, okay, if, you know, there's at least a 48-hour period, then that should count as a successful overthrow of the government, even if there is subsequently a reversal. But these things, sometimes it's down to subjective judgment calls that scholars make. And, you know, in my view, there's not a very hard and fast rule. And that's why, you know, I've also been rather reticent in, you know, obsessing about, okay, how many coups has Africa had? Because at the end of the day, for me, it's not even very helpful to say Africa has had 100 coups. Or, you know, what I am more interested in is centering the oversized role of the armed forces and how they have deleterious implications for the way African states are governed. I mean, I think I'll stop there, and perhaps we can.
Thank you very much, Moses. Shadrack, the discussant, is going to respond to one of the questions that have been asked. But I just wanted to say, so someone asked why are young people jubilating when there is a coup. I mean, it's clear that, you know, people aren't fools. They know clearly that military coups are not a response to their problems, but the aspiration for change has been overwhelming. And but I think what is interesting in the case of the Sahel, So over the past few weeks and months, steps have been taken as a response to expectations as to what the military is meant to do in the time that they'll be in power as a matter of transition. In Niger, steps are being taken to nationalize the supply for electricity and water, and the same is being done with exploitation of uranium. Same in Mali. There are advanced discussions to restructure the exploitation of gold. Gold is quite important. Mali is one of the largest producers of gold in the world. You find Malian gold everywhere in the world, and Mali barely benefits from it. So there has been attempts to respond to expectations linked to transition moments. Anyway, yeah, so Shadrack is going to...
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just wanted to respond to the question that this gentleman here asked about the role of the military in the context of COVID-19 from the perspective of the paper by Isaac, which I read. According to Isaac, when COVID hit, you see, the governments in Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, they pulled their forces, their military forces from counter-insurgency engagements and now redeployed them to enforce the measures put in place to mitigate COVID-19, including enforcing the lockdowns. Now, what happened is that once these were now engaged in enforcing lockdowns, they began violating the human rights of individual citizens. They became a security threat to their citizens, and in that way, they helped enhance the propaganda of the terrorist movements against the state, helping the terrorists to recruit even more. So in other words, that COVID-19 and the pulling out of the military forces from engaging in counterinsurgency was then a boon to terrorist movements, and it helped increase the violence on their part and their capacity to even occupy more territory. Finally, 1 second, I would like to add to what Moses said about Thomas Sankara and the idea that he was also ousted by a coup. But in my view, it was not just the ordinary coups and counter-coups that have been characteristic of countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and so on that you so ably illustrate. The case of Sankara is a unique one, in the sense that the coup that ousted him was not as a result of internal dynamics. His revolutionary ideas were a threat to entrenched interests of the neocolonial, colonial and neocolonial interests at the regional and international level. The coup that ousted Sankara was actually organized by the French. The French used Côte d'Ivoire to influence Blaise Compaoré to take over power. So it is a much more unique case than just the ordinary coups and counter-coups against each other within the context of African politics. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much to the two speakers and to the discussant. That was a very useful discussion and a great way to celebrate the publication of this bulletin, which again, I would encourage you to read. So ES would like to say a few things about tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Ami, and the panelists for indulging us. We are very grateful that we've been able to pull off this, especially given that it was a last-minute decision to convene a panel around the bulletin that Ami has just announced. We have copies of the bulletin. Some are here, some are at the door towards when you are walking out. Please feel free to take as many as you can, including those ones that you will take to your libraries back home. And we also had a special issue of a bulletin that has essays that Professor Njomo Kwame Sundaram has written. Some of them his own essays, others co-authored with colleagues. We collected, out of the many that he has written, we collected a few, And we also have a special issue of CODESRIA bulletin that you can make reference to. Some of the ideas he discussed today actually find space in this special issue of CODESRIA bulletin. Pick as many as you want today, tomorrow. They are absolutely free. And if you are not old school like me and you prefer an online one, they are all going to be live by the end of the week on our website. Again, feel free to take them. So we've come to the end of our second day of the General Assembly. Tomorrow is going to be slightly different. So I just wanted to make sure that we all are on the same page. Unlike today when we started at 9, tomorrow we are starting at 8:30. Unlike today when we started at 9, tomorrow we are starting at 8:30. And the reason is really simple, so I'm hoping that you will understand. We're running up to 9 parallel sessions at a time. We're running up to 9 parallel sessions at a time. What that means is that we're going to operate like a military. If there is anything good we can say about military tradition. We have, if you recall, the amphitheater where we were yesterday, we would walk out and the corridor that curves around the amphitheater, we have a number of rooms there. So you please try to locate your room in advance. We've spoken to the chairs of the panels and we've requested them to start the sessions on time. We've also assigned for each room 2 CODESRIA staff, and they have a license to control time. They have a license given to them to control time. Again, that's a military tradition where control of time is very important. We won't control speech, we will control time. So I want to encourage you to please bear with us. I'm hoping that tomorrow we'll finish on time because we need a deep rest. On Thursday is going to a slightly longer day than is normal. So all the very best for your evening rest. Thank you very much for indulging us. Senkoro, you are raising up your hand, but we've closed the session. We will talk to the chairs of the panels. They will handle that question. So thank you very much. Have a very good evening. Take a good rest, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bulletins are here.